Hello, my name is Christopher Strain. I'm an historian and professor of American Studies at the Wilkes Honors College of Florida Atlantic University. I study and teach U.S. history, African American history, and American studies at FAU. I've published 4 books, including one on the Civil Rights Movement and another about hate crime in the 1990s, and I'm working on a 5th. And the other day, something clicked for me. I was able to contextualize my place in American history. Let me explain. I had a big quarantined pandemic birthday this year. I turned 50 years old, a half century. And while I teach all of American history from the colonial period to the present, it occurred to me that if you consider American history to be about 500 years old, since Columbus and the age of European exploration and conquest, then I have personally lived and experienced about 1/10 of American history, a not insignificant fraction. If you consider US history to be about 250 years old, since the Declaration of Independence and the founding of the Republic, then I have been around for 1/5 of it, which kind of boggles my mind. Either way you slice it, I have lived a big chunk of American history. And I tell you this because periodically we have to think about our place in space and in time, particularly if we presume to teach history. We have to ask ourselves, how much of what I know of history is filtered through personal experience and remembrance or by political inclination, and how much of it is informed by careful study and reflection. It's our job to teach honestly and fairly. To do so, we have to interrogate ourselves and our prejudices and presumptions and do our best to be objective and apprehend the truth with a capital T and share that truth with our students. It's not an easy job, but it's an extremely important one because our students depend on our academic integrity. Today, we're going to talk about African American history. The title of this session is Enriching Black History by Rethinking Black History Month. And African American history is not only a richly textured and layered tapestry of people and events, a chronicle of African Americans and their unique stories and experiences, but also a seminal part of US history itself, perhaps the central component of the master narrative of American history. An author named Albert Murray has referred to Black Americans as omni-Americans, a term that captures the quintessential Americanness of African Americans and their history. And I agree with Murray that Black Americans belong at the center of any attempt to understand the United States. I want to begin by suggesting to you something really, really important, I think. It's the main point of my session here today. And if you take away only one thing from this presentation, then take away this message. You ready? Here it comes. Black folks are greater than the sum of the injustices committed against them. Let me repeat. Black folks are greater than the sum of the injustices committed against them. Oftentimes during Black History Month, lessons focus on slavery and terror and the Ku Klux Klan and lynching and Jim Crow and oppression and repression. And the impression given to school kids is that Black history is terrible and tragic and awful. And it's true that a major theme in Black history is inflicted trauma and woe. It's why we have blues music, right? But It's not all trauma. Black history is full of joy and beauty and romance and creativity and wonder. If you only focus on the horrors perpetrated against African Americans, which we historians of the Black experience often do, myself included, you not only miss the good done by African Americans, but also deny Black agency in living rich, fully textured lives apart from white folks. It's hard to strike a balance, right? Too much trauma, and you miss the joy and beauty. Too much of the latter, and you risk overlooking the genuine prejudice and discrimination that has existed and continues to exist. So I want to talk about a couple of possibilities, a couple of solutions, I think, particularly as we think about Black History Month and how to teach Black history during Black History Month. If you'll bear with me just a second, I'm going to share my screen, I hope, and share a few slides. Here we go. All right, I hope you can see this. One solution is to talk about Black history and Black life and Black culture using more than the 28 days allotted in February during Black History Month. Wouldn't you know that they made Black History Month during the shortest month of the year? 28 days is not enough to cover what needs to be covered. This is a calendar. This is a picture of a calendar from FAU, from the BSU, the Black Student Union, from this year, from February 2021, a calendar of events for Black History Month. And they crammed a lot in, but still not really enough time to get to everything. Let me tell you a little bit about the history of Black history. In 1924, historian Carter G. Woodson, who's pictured here at left, encouraged his fraternity brothers in Omega Psi Phi to spread word about Negro History and Literature Week, which was renamed Negro Achievement Week. But Woodson recognized that it was not enough. He worked through the organization he created, the Association for the Study of Negro Life and History, ASNLH, to establish Negro History Week in 1927. And it was still not enough for Woodson, who believed that African American history was too important to America and to the world to be crammed into a limited time frame. Before he died in 1950, he spoke of a shift from Negro History Week to Negro History Year. In the late 1960s, young civil rights activists pushed for a change from Negro History Week to Black History Month. And we now may have to stretch Black History Month to convey the richness and breadth and depth of the Black experience in our school curriculum. So that's one possibility. Another solution, and this is what the bulk of what I'm going to talk about today is really about, is to center stories of Black resistance and Black empowerment in your teaching. Last summer, I was interviewed for the Teaching Hard History podcast, hosted by Dr. Hassan Jeffries at Ohio State University and developed by the Southern Poverty Law Center's Teaching Tolerance Program, which was recently renamed Learning for Justice. It was a program founded in 1991 to prevent the growth of hate via education. Teaching Hard History was created to support middle school and high school educators who are committed to teaching difficult topics in the classroom. In 2019, the podcast focused on American slavery, and in 2020, it focused on the civil rights movement. On slavery, Dr. Jeffries writes, and I have a picture of Dr. Jeffries here doing one of his TED Talks. These are his words, not mine. He said, The central role that slavery played in the development of the United States is beyond dispute. And yet, we the people do not like to talk about slavery or even think about it, much less teach it or learn it. The implications of doing so unnerve us. If the cornerstone of the Confederacy was slavery, then what does that say about those who revere the people who took up arms to keep African Americans in chains? If James Madison, the principal architect of the Constitution, could hold people in bondage his entire life, refusing to free a single soul even upon his death, then what does that say about our nation's founders, about our nation itself? Dr. Jeffries goes on, slavery is hard history. It is hard to comprehend the inhumanity that defined it. It is hard to discuss the violence that sustained it. It is hard to teach the ideology of white supremacy that justified it, and it is hard to learn about those who abided it. We, the people, have a deep-seated aversion to hard history because we are uncomfortable with the implications it raises about the past as well as the present. We, the people, would much rather have the Disney version of history, in which villains are easily spotted, suffering never lasts long, heroes invariably prevail, and life always gets better. End quote. But Dr. Jeffries points out how avoiding the most troubling aspects of our past not only miseducates students, but also leads to bad policymaking in our present and perpetuates racial inequality today. Here's one more image of Dr. Jeffries in action. This is from a conference that I attended with him. Hassan is a friend of mine, so that's why I'm putting so many pics of him up. Teaching hard history provides ways for teachers to tackle difficult subjects like slavery and civil rights in the classroom. Dr. Jeffries also points out that, quote, the saga of slavery is not exclusively a story of despair. In other words, hard history is not hopeless history. These are, again, his words, not mine. I'm quoting Dr. Jeffries. Finding the promise and possibility within this history requires us to consider the lives of the enslaved on their own terms. Trapped in an unimaginable hell, enslaved people forged unbreakable bonds with one another. Indeed, no one knew better the meaning and importance of family and community than the enslaved. They fought back too, in the field and in the house, pushing back against enslavers in ways that ranged from feigned ignorance to flight to armed rebellion. There is no greater hope to be found in American history, Jeffries writes, than in African Americans' resistance to slavery, end quote. And teaching hard history offers these stories of resistance in an easily digestible format, one that you can listen to while multitasking, right? We all love podcasts for that reason. So I encourage you to check out the Teaching Hard History podcast. Years ago, I wrote a research article about a place called Soul City, a planned community in Upper North Carolina, founded in the early 1970s by civil rights leader Floyd McKissick, who's pictured here. If teaching hard history offers stories of empowerment through resistance, then Soul City offers stories of empowerment through creation. Soul City is an amazing example of Black leadership and entrepreneurship from the Black Power era of the civil rights movement, the often neglected post-1968 period of the civil rights struggle. McKissick, who was a lawyer, was the national director of the Congress of Racial Equality, or CORE, which was one of the key civil rights organizations of the 1960s. And McKissick envisioned a bold experiment in interracial living and Black empowerment, a brand new city to be developed in rural Warren County, North Carolina, a poor area deep in the clan country of the Carolina Piedmont, where 7 out of 10 adults lacked a high school diploma and 40% of homes lacked indoor plumbing. McKissick imagined a multiracial community led by African Americans that would not only bring money and jobs to this impoverished region, but also reverse the exodus of poor Blacks from the rural South and ease overcrowding in northern slums. These are a couple of images. That's McKissick again at left, out in front of Soul City. And this is an advertisement at right, a pamphlet that was distributed to encourage people to come to Soul City. A dedicated group of brave individuals did just that. They flocked to Soul City, where McKissick worked to secure funding for a health center and a factory called Soul Tech One, a 72,000 square foot manufacturing plant constructed in 1975. The streets at Soul City were named after heroes of Black history. There was Turner Circle and Brown Circle and Scott Circle. These seemingly innocuous names, until one realized that these roads were named for Nat Turner and John Brown and Dred Scott. The venture had the backing of not only the governor of North Carolina, but also President Richard Nixon, who heard in McKissick's messaging a commitment to capitalism that was much preferable to the radical pronouncements of some militants of this time, like the Black Panthers. Whereas some Black Power advocates focused on electoral politics and race pride and cultural nationalism and or Marxist revolution, McKissick focused heavily on economics. The key for him was control and self-determination through enterprise and ownership. McKissick was accused of being a dreamer, a sort of pie in the sky, utopian visionary. But for him, Black Power was Black capitalism, the only practical path to economic parity. After much planning and anticipation, the project never fully materialized as intended, but its legend as an ambitious Black Power era pre-new urbanist development continues to the present day. And Soul City, while not the thriving live-work hub envisioned by McKissick, is still there in Warren County for anyone who'd like to visit. In fact, the slide at left here is a pic that I took myself at Soul City a few years ago. Recently, I was asked to review a new book by a law professor at Seton Hall, a guy named Thomas Healy. The book is called Soul City, Race Equality and the Lost Dream of an American Utopia. There's a picture of the cover of that book here at center, the orange cover. And I encourage you to check out Healy's book or my colleague Devin Fergus's 2009 book, Liberalism, Black Power, and the Making of American Politics, 1965 to 1980. Or if you'd like to read a briefer, abridged version of the Soul City story, you can check out my article called Soul City, North Carolina, Black Power, Utopia, and the African American Dream, which was published in the winter 2004 issue of the Journal of African American History. Another way to connect with students is through music. Listen to music in the classroom with your students. Discuss the lyrics and themes. Appreciate the music apart from the lyrics and themes. You don't have to be a professional music critic or a writer for Rolling Stone or Spin or Vibe to talk about music. My own knowledge of pop music is limited and definitely dated. My students sometimes roll their eyes when I start to wax poetic about Public Enemy or De La Soul or Queen Latifah, but music is something we can all relate to. Besides, hip hop is a cultural force that extends far beyond the music itself, and your students are already listening to it and living it. For a helpful resource, you can even play around with Flocabulary's Hip Hop US History, which uses original raps to introduce US history to students. All of these and more are fun and innovative ways to reimagine Black history for your classroom. I was deeply inspired a few months ago by a piece written by John Blake, who's pictured here, in January for CNN, a piece that he wrote on the need for more trauma-free Blackness, as he calls it, striking expressions of Black life that aren't filtered through the lens of racism. These are his words. 2020 was a difficult year for Americans and a particularly difficult year for African Americans. Blake writes, "We watched videos of Black men being brutalized or killed and read about Black women fatally shot in their homes by police. We've watched a pandemic devastate our community." And in this article, he talks about how at times he felt exhausted by what he called the relentlessness of Black grief. But he was reminded by a friend of vast regions of Black life that have nothing to do with suffering or oppression. He was reminded of the rugged endurance of Black people. And in this article, Blake catalogs some examples of these vast regions. He talks about Black girls playing double dutch with a jump rope. He talks about Black family reunions. He talks about homecomings at HBCUs. He talks about step shows by service fraternities. He talks about joy parades. He talks about the YouTube twins watching music videos together for the first time and recording their impressions on YouTube. He talks about Marcus Bridgewater, known as Garden Marcus, and his uplifting TikTok videos on plants and positivity. He talks about Tyler Perry's Medea movies. He talks about Earth, Wind, and Fire. He talks about Stevie Wonder and Beyonce and Louis Armstrong. He talks about Key and Peele. He talks about Octavia Butler and her sci-fi novels, and a host of Black artists and performers whose work has illuminated American life. Speaking of which, I want to finish up by talking a little bit about Zora Neale Hurston. If you are an English teacher, a language arts teacher, a rhetoric and composition teacher, a writing instructor, or even a history or social studies teacher, assign Zora Neale Hurston's "Their Eyes Were Watching God" to your students. It was published in 1937, and "Their Eyes Were Watching God" is a gorgeous jewel of a book, a beautifully written, life-affirming, poetic novel about a strong Black woman. The protagonist, Janie Crawford, sort of pirouettes through different men who would own her and control her. Numerous suitors are drawn to her strength and beauty, but it is her volatile, loving relationship with the younger, no account tea cake that the novel so expertly details. Also crucial for us is that Janie's story takes place here in South Florida. The sights and smells and natural phenomena described by Hurston, from the sweet cane fields and the rich muck of the glades to the savage hurricanes that ravage the Western communities, should resonate with your students. I'm going to turn off my slideshow, or stop sharing, and get back to me. There, I think I am again. I want to read just the first few lines of this novel if you're not familiar with it. It's probably my favorite book, my favorite novel. I just think it's lovely. And this just gives you a tiny taste. This is the first paragraph. "Ships at a distance have every man's wish on board. For some, they come in with the tide. For others, they sail forever on the horizon, never out of sight, never landing until the watcher turns his eyes away in resignation, his dreams mocked to death by time. That is the life of men." It's so good, I can't hardly stand it. Check it out and read it. Large portions of the book are written in dialect, but don't be afraid. Have your students read this novel, read it alongside them, read it with them, read it aloud to them. Enjoy this book, one of the best in American literature. Enjoy it together with your students. Hurston is a masterful writer. Yeah. In the waning days of his presidency, Donald Trump released the guidelines of the 1776 Commission, his administration's response to the New York Times 1619 Project, which focused on America's history of racism. The 1776 Commission guidelines recommended that the positive aspects of US history be taught in schools, that we mustn't speak only of America's sins while denying her greatness. It's a direct quote from the recommendations. And of course, this decree is problematic, not only because the government would presume to dictate how, educators teach history in the classroom, of trampling teacher autonomy, but also because it diverges from critical historical inquiry into propaganda. But the point about teaching positive history is one point, perhaps the only point, where I actually agree with the Commission's recommendations, especially when applied to African American history. While we need not teach Disney-fied history, we do need more positive stories to round out our understanding of Black history. As is, the way we teach it, at least during Black History Month, is imbalanced, reductionist, unrepresentative, and I think inaccurate. As my colleague Daryl Scott, a historian at Howard University, has pointed out, Black people made 400 years of history in British North America, and all we hear about is racism and slavery. Devoting more class time to Black history and centering stories of Black resistance and Black empowerment in our teaching can help to correct the problem. Thank you for your time and your consideration, and good luck with your teaching endeavors. Thanks.